Okay, I think we can begin. There seems to be a good crowd joining us tonight. Welcome to the Saturday Night LaRouche Pact seminar. This is the second class by Brian Lance. For those of you who missed the first one last week, it'll be up on our website. It is up on our website, and you can catch up on it. Even if you missed it, you will be able to follow what's being discussed tonight. I think there's a growing realization in the country. A lot of people are waking up to the fact that there's something seriously wrong with our economy, and we're facing all kinds of threats to the economic stability, not just of the United States, but to the rest of the world. Some of this has been provoked by the blowback from the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Russia, which really threatens the stability of the dollar system, threatens the physical economy, and we're seeing the effects of that already in the United States in terms of massive inflation. And there's also fairly reliable forecasts that the sanctions are going to begin to take a huge effect on the food situation in the world, because Russia and Ukraine are not only big producers of food, in fact, the main producer of food for many African and Asian countries, but Russia itself is also one of the biggest producers of fertilizer. And this is the planting season in the northern hemisphere, and that's already driving up costs. Now, this is not the only contributor to the inflation crisis. As Brian just presented to us last week, this is a result of decades of policies which have eaten away at the productive capacity of the United States. Now, when I say there's a growing realization of this, I think if we talk among ourselves and also talk to people, you talk to people, a lot of people can articulate this. In other words, everybody knows at least a lot of the things that are wrong with the economy and can prognosticate that things are going to get much worse. So I don't think we have to spend a lot of time or we get anywhere by delineating all those things. What's most important right now is, what do we do about it? What kind of economic policy do we have to implement in the United States? And this is really up to the American people to do, because if you look at Washington and the mainstream politicians and also the mainstream economists, you see that they don't have a clue of what's to do. In fact, everything they've told us up till now has been a complete lie. Their forecasts have all been wrong. This is particularly true with Joe Biden, but it's also true with everybody who claims to be an economist. So the issue here is that the American people have to know what we need to do, and then we have to make that happen. And our best shot at making it happen is to make a big transformation in the politics of this country. That means kick out the current regime in Congress in 2022, and then hope we can, and then get a change in the presidency in 2024. President Trump has indicated that he is going to run. We'll see if he does. Hopefully he will. But in order, when he runs and when we get a new Congress, that Congress has to be able to implement something. And right now, it's clear that both the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress don't really have a clue about what they need to implement. So that's why we have Brian Lance here. He is
good to be back.
Yeah, he's a very serious economist who does, contrary to other people who have terminal degrees in economics. He knows something about the economy and how it works. He spent many years studying it and researching it, as well as, most importantly, studying and collaborating with Lyndon LaRouche when he was alive and leading this movement. So without further ado, let me just introduce Brian, and he will give you the material, explain to you what it is we actually need to do. And then in the discussion period, you can ask your questions and make sure that you don't leave the seminar tonight without having a firm idea of what it is we need to do as a nation to reverse this economic crisis. So without further ado, Brian, why don't you tell us what you know?
Okay. Well, well, first, I think just to reemphasize a couple of key points. Look, the war going on right now is not against Putin. It's not against Russia. The war is a war of the oligarchy against the sovereign nation state, all sovereign nation states, to obliterate them. And in particular, Russia, China, and the United States. And that's what's underway. President Trump has said he will put America first. President Putin is doing the same thing with his nation, and Xi with his. So that's the backdrop. The battle here is defeat the oligarchy, the financial oligarchy that is playing this game of divide and rule, or divide and destroy, if you will. The sanctions, when we look at the sanctions are aimed at the American people. They're not affecting the Russian economy, not significantly. They're having a tremendous impact on us and other nations around the world. So that by way of backdrop, I think that's just important. So there's a battlefield, but the battlefield is between the sovereign nation state, and we must lead, the American people, the United States must lead that fight of the American people against oligarchy, against the oligarchical power structure that's come down to us. You know, you can take it back, you know, to the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire. It's come down to us today, Venice, the lowlands, the city of London. That's who the enemy here is. So there's this war. Okay, well, we're choosing the battlefield, and the battlefield is the U.S. economy, the American economy. And I hope that it will be clear by the end of our discussion today that a critical part of that battle is to be a four-power agreement between Putin, most importantly, President Trump, Xi Jinping, and Modi of India, a four-power agreement in the process of creating then a new fixed exchange rate, gold reserve financial system, hard commodity-based financial system. This will replace the central banking system by which our economy and other economies have been run into the ground. It will replace the Federal Reserve System. That's our job, with a third national bank and national credit. And it'll clear the way for moving further into that new frontier that John F. Kennedy identified in 1961, the new frontier and all the challenges of it. In Florence, South Carolina, President Trump said, he put it back on the front burner for us, that his responsibility, our responsibility, was to restore the United States as a manufacturing superpower. And he also emphasized, I think these are the two most essential points in his remarks there, that we had to clean out, and he would clean out, the entire foreign establishment of the United States, foreign policy establishment. that establishment in the State Department and otherwise is opposed to the sovereign nation state. In this context, we're uniquely qualified and uniquely located with LaRouche's ideas, the materials that we've developed to play the leadership role in this environment. And just briefly, the American system of economics is what has to be brought forward again in this country. We're turning the ship right side up. Okay, that's the American system that began with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, informed by 150 years that before that, going back to the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Winthrops, and so forth. That system launched our nation as the first sovereign republic in the world. That system was revived again by Lincoln with the greenback policy. And we became a manufacturing power in the globe at that time, emerging out of the Civil War as one of the great powers of the world, economically, the leading industrial power in the world. It was revived again out of the Depression in the recovery of the FDR administration, a collaborative effort, Republicans and Democrats, that rebuilt the nation and then led us to victory in World War II with our allies, which at that time included the Soviet Union and China, among other nations. And we saw a rebirth again of that American system outlook and policy with the moonshot of John F. Kennedy. And I think that's really, to summarize, that's what we bring to the table. We bring that to the table. And we have to, I think really our responsibility is to make economics, to make the American system of political economy, a physical economy as LaRouche identifies it, the very heart of the deliberations in our nation over the coming weeks and months, to make the topic of the American economy, that as a topic of discussion and deliberation, live and breathe in our nation. So that's what we're about. Many of you have already been engaged in this effort, but I want to just underscore that. And then, okay, just briefly, okay, in terms of the economy, all right, I don't have to tell you a lot about our circumstances. Where are we now? Well, it's not getting manufactured here, not as much as should be, for sure. Most of it's coming from Asia, 8,000 plus miles away, from someplace in Southeast Asia to Kansas City, Missouri. That's 8,000 miles as the crow flies or the seagull, but that's, there it comes, or it's supposed to be coming, from manufacture to barge to cargo ship across the Pacific, discharged in Long Beach or Los Angeles, then trying to catch the rail, a boxcar, or load on a container onto a railroad, a unit train, and then of course going on from there, and hopefully it ends up at your doorstep if you ordered it. Last mile, as they call it, in terms of delivery. But it's broken down, right? It's crumbled. Under the volume, $1 trillion deficit last year, trade deficit. All of the third-party logistics, the containers, all of it. It's broken down. Now, what we require then, we require a full set economy. That's what we require. We need to bring back, we need again, a full set economy for our nation. That means a third national bank and national credit, as we've been discussing it over the past several weeks, these Saturdays, and available on our website. Our nation and every nation requires such a full set economy, or at least an approximation to a full set economy. What do I mean by that? Every nation has to have the capacity to advance its scientific and technological capacities, capabilities. It has to be able to manufacture the essential goods of its nation. It must be able, as Bruce mentioned briefly, every nation needs to be able to produce its own food security, educate its citizens, secure its borders, build up, of course, underlying that, the infrastructure, water, energy, healthcare that's required for the nation, for that nation, any nation. And that is the means by which the national credit, when we'll come back to this, the national credit of every nation is secured, their ability to invest into the future. Now, just to counterpose, just to be clear, you'll see this really the moment I say it. But this is completely contrary to the idea of comparative advantage. That comes down to us from the British East India's David Ricardo. You can find it in the Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith as well. He was an employee of the British East India Company, right? They said, oh, well, the United States, oh, you can be a farm country, you can be agrarian. We'll produce things here and we'll trade. Oh, yeah, you can imagine the conditions. Well, we did imagine, we knew the conditions. That's why we made an American Revolution. So-called comparative advantage, which is really nothing more elaborate than buy cheap, sell dear. There's not anything scientific about it, but it's the swan song of, well, your country can produce this and we'll produce this, and then we'll trade and we'll all be better off. Well, no, that's a sophism. That's a recipe for disaster, and it has been a disaster. Now, central to a full set economy, again, very briefly, is the strategic machine tool principle. Lyndon LaRouche identifies this at the core. From the discovery of and proof of a new physical principle, to prototype, to machine tool design and production, to capital goods production, to finished goods. And what is the outcome of that process? The outcome of that process is a more productive nation, a more productive people, a more productive workforce, and a growing workforce. Every new discovery translates through the machine tool design principle into a new advanced productive capacities, which advance mankind, advance our nation. They increase the power of labor, the multiplication of labor. I mean, it's not it improves the population itself, but it's not simply a cycle. It's not, it's not just a loop, right? Think of it as a spiral, geometrically as a spiral going up, ever expanding outward and upward, growing the economy. That's the process that's central to the concept of a full set economy. A full set economy is not a fixed economy. It's a growing, expanding, developing, self-developing process. So we had a full set economy. Between 1870 and 1970, we had a surplus we had a surplus in trade every year from 1870 to 1970. With all the ups and downs that went on, we produced. That didn't mean we didn't trade, but trade was a minor part of our economic activity by comparison. In 1970, 10% of our GDP, just to use that as a rough kind of way of looking at it, 10% of our GDP was in imports and exports combined. Only 10%. You know, it's several fold that's now. So we were a productive and have been a productive nation. And I think that's obvious to many of us, most of us. As we look back, we think back what we know from our parents, our grandparents, and so forth. That's where we came from. Now, as I said before, we've got to, if you will, right the ship. And then thinking about that, you know, if nations around the world have their own security, if they come to the table as secure nations, economically secure, because they have a full set or approximately full set economies, it's under those conditions that we can reach agreements to ensure our the durable survival of mankind. Now I want to look briefly. I was asked to look to bring briefly into the picture here quickly some aspects of this. What's required in terms of a full set economy? What are we going to address? What do we need to address? So let's start with steel. Not stealing the vote, steel production. You know, this is upstream. This is, if you're looking at that, at the physical economy, right? You're looking at upstream from manufacturing itself, our heavy machinery production, machine tool production itself. Think of cement, steel, of course, further upstream are the raw materials, the hard commodities. And so let's take steel as an example of that upstream, their upstream requirements of the United States. Well, right now, today, we have 9 integrated steel mills in the United States. There's only 9 of them left. I mean, by integrated, I mean from producing the coke from coal to the blast furnace that produces pig iron to the oxygen blast furnace, OBF, the oxygen blast furnace that then turns out steel and rolls it and so forth. That's an integrated steel mill. We have only 9 of those left. We're importing 20% or more of our steel right now. The rest of our steel, by the way, the last integrated steel mill was built in 1964. But what's happening otherwise? Obviously, we're producing some steel. Yes, we're producing it with what are called electric arc furnaces. What do? They take scrap metal. They take scrap metal and reprocess it and produce steel. Fine and well. Well, in the existing economy today, we don't even produce enough scrap. We don't even produce enough scrap to feed those electric arc furnaces. We're importing scrap metal from around the world. And you know where we're importing it? Some of the best pig iron, there's different grades of it, but some of the best pig iron, like direct reduction iron it's called, is coming from Ukraine and Russia. Go figure. Now think about the consequences of that. A growing economy, an expanding economy, which we require, rebuilding our infrastructure, rail, expanding our rail system, both passenger, but particularly freight. Nuclear power, a nuclear power plant, you're talking about hundreds of tons of steel into a single nuclear power plant. So where's that steel going to come from? We can't rely on scrap. This is, electric arc furnaces are talked about as being a green version of steel production. I mean, what a hoax. We're having to raid the world for scrap to feed those furnaces. We're going to have to build additional integrated steel mills, locate them around the country productively, close to new sources, for example, in the West, elsewhere. That's national credit. That's where national credit emitted from the national bank comes in. Remember, the Federal Reserve does not lend money into the real economy. As we discussed last week and has been discussed before by Bob Ingram and others, the Federal Reserve lends into a group of primary dealers. Right now, about 24 of them, Goldman Sachs and the rest. And they lend into the speculative economy. They're speculating on steel right now. They're stealing our steel, if you will. They're into copper. They're into nickel, grain, and so forth. We'll come to agriculture in a second. You get the picture. So we're going to build a bunch of steel mills. Well, we're going to create the credit to get those steel mills built, and we'll find the companies and so forth that want to grow a growing economy. And if U.S. Steel and Cleveland Cliffs wants to come along and join in, well, that's great, but we're going to get it done. That's national credit in action. That's what's required. We're going to have to do that. President Trump, instituted tariffs on steel imports. That's a useful step. Now we got to have a national bank. We've got to have national credit. We've got to build up our steel production because it is upstream from manufacturing. It's upstream from infrastructure. So that's an example. Housing construction. If you remember, we had a savings and loan system in this country that built homes. It's a sad situation today. We used to produce approximately 500,000 entry-level homes, about 1,200 square feet a year. In 2020, we produced 65,000. We've got, in the last 10 years, we have 12 million more new households, families, all right? But we have half as many houses being built for them. The housing crunch. Where did that come from? A housing shortage. Where did that come? From a lack of a national credit system that builds out the housing and the living standards of our workforce, of our people, of our country. I mentioned savings and loan. They were rescued during by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the 1930s and built out from there as a system that worked around the country. Today, we have community banks. There's over 4,000 of them. In many states, Kansas, for example, 85% of all bank branches are community banks. In Oklahoma, 67% of deposits in banks are in community banks, and so on. These are the fabric of small communities around the United States that we want to grow again. So these community banks, along with others, are a natural for credit, for the emission of credit from the national bank into community banks around the country. The idea of a national bank is it's not squatting there in Washington, D.C. You have branches around the country in one form or another, but you multiply that by utilizing the private banking system, and community banks are a natural outlet for this. to make available credit, cheap credit, right? Right now, mortgages are up to, new mortgages are being written at 4.5%, and that's going up. The crunch on housing is going to get worse until we make it better. So let's make it better. Okay, well, you start building housing, then you say, oh, well, we need lumber. We got a lumber shortage, don't we? Well, yes. Well, we haven't been logging our national forests for decades. We used to log 10 to 12 billion, that's billion board feet a year in the 1990s, right? Today, we log 1 to 3 billion board feet a year, right? A tenth, and we wonder why there's a lumber shortage. Well, national credit. We got lots of lots of entrepreneurs out there. We got lots of loggers or would-be loggers or semi-retired loggers. Let's get some sawmills built. Let's get some roads built. Let's get surveys. Let's get roads built. Let's get the sawmills in there. And let's, in a very rational, reasonable way, harvest a portion of the assets we have. And it's a replaceable asset, our forests, as opposed to leaving them to burn down, as we've seen in, in the Western states in recent times, because we ignore them. We don't take care of them. So again, here is national credit emitted into the economy to meet the real needs, the housing in this case, needs of the American people. Okay, food. Let's turn briefly to food. Biden's been in Brussels. The avatar named Biden, he's been in Brussels and he's telling us there's going to be food shortages and it's going to be bad. It's quote, going to be bad. Really intelligent. All right, well, take fertilizer. Bruce mentioned it earlier. Well, there's a cartel. There's the big three in fertilizer. People probably know there's three kinds of basic fertilizer: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate. All right. Well, there's the big three that are producing it. There's Mosaic, probably never heard of it, Nutrien, and CF Industries. Mosaic, which is based in Tampa, Florida, controls, according to at least some analyses, 90% of the nitrogen market in the United States. Even if you take a low figure, they control 70% of the North American market. That brings us to Nutrien, which is the third largest potash, that's potassium producer that's mined, right? Nitrogen, you get it out of the air, right? It takes a lot of energy, natural gas, nitrogen out of the air, you make ammonia, you make nitrogen fertilizer. With potassium and phosphates, you're mining that. Well, Nutrien is the world's largest producer of potash mining, and it's the third largest nitrogen producer. And then you have CF Industries. They're the largest nitrogen producer overall in the world. 17 ammonia plants. And there's others, there's Yara out of Norway, that, there's also Yara New USA as as part of that, within that umbrella. The Coke company, Coke Industries, they've got a hand in fertilizers, etc. Their stocks are up 40 to 60 to 70% just in the first 3 months of this year. And as a policy, they've announced they're buying back their own shares and they're paying out expanded dividends. They're not expanding production. All right. National credit. There's lots of other would-be producers. There's small producers beyond the ones I've mentioned. Hey, we need fertilizer. Ammonia plants can be built almost anywhere. Like I said, nitrogen, natural gas, that's what you need. You can build them anywhere. Potash, potassium, you open up those mines. You use the Defense Production Act. You use elbow grease. You use antitrust, the threat of antitrust litigation. You can move this. If you're committed as a nation and you're using national credit, we can move these things. We can break this. We can break these shortages, these manipulated shortages. Just to mention it briefly, just think about ethanol. You know, we've got 30 million acres in this country in corn production, and a third of that is producing ethanol, which costs more than the gasoline it's put in. Nuts. We can do a much better job, and we can move away from monoculture, and we can promote the development of new farms and farms that utilize their capabilities in a multiplicity of ways, as opposed to single crop, massive so-called corporate farms. Most farms are incorporated, but you know, these large corporate operations. This will kill us. So these are a few examples. Meat packing is another cartel situation. We know it. You know, that's well known. So I'm not going to spend time on it. But those are three areas. But the speculation in these areas, you know, there's just recently a report of, you know, it's a Kansas farmer in Healy, Kansas. His name's Vance Emke. He's a wheat farmer, and boy, he saw these the wheat prices, you know, double to $12, $13 a bushel. Well, he said, okay, well, I'm going to sell the futures of my crop that's coming in. He couldn't sell to anybody. Because why? Because the farm cooperatives, the grain elevators, the flour millers, the exporters were scared. If they bought at those prices in the future, you know, there's their futures that are being sold, those prices might crash before then. So the farmers are not benefiting, you know, maybe some in some cases and so forth, but overall, the farmers are not the ones gaining from these food prices. This is all in speculation, right? This is hedge funds and so forth dominating these futures markets. And these little guys, you know, even if you're talking about flour millers and so forth, they can't afford to go in there and get stuck in a position and have margin calls and be pushed to the wall in bankruptcy. So this is part of what's you know, shutting down, imploding the movement of food to the market, just as an example. So this is where the credit has to go. The credit has to go, obviously, not into, you know, primary dealers. You know, the Fed, as Robert Ingram has documented in the recent webcast, the Fed has to be, this was LaRouche's proposal, has to be put through a bankruptcy reorganization. It's got to be replaced. Essentially, you can utilize the buildings, you can utilize the various offices around the country of the Federal Reserve, but you'd simply occupy it as the national bank, shall we say. And you run a national bank, not through Jerome Powell or somebody, but you run a national bank as through an appointed board, appointed by the Congress and the President of the United States. And you lend, then you emit credit, rather, to be clear about this, into the areas of the economy and around the country as required. That's what you have local offices for, is to be the eyes and ears, and to see what's happening, to see what's needed. And at the same time, of course, people and companies and entrepreneurs and so forth are coming to you. State governments know a lot, and so on. So you can figure these things out. You can work these things through. We can work them through as a deliberative, intentional process. So we do this with protective measures. We do this with regulatory measures. We're setting boundary conditions on the economy. We're funneling our credit, our future ability to produce. We're identifying and we're ensuring we make that real. We bring it into being. And this is where capital goods comes into play. This is where transformative investments, credits to aid the process of moving from prototype into manufacturing. It's a big deal. It's very expensive. If you're in South Korea, Japan, much less China, the government's there to help you to finance that leap, to bring together a collaboration of universities, research institutes, manufacturers, individual manufacturers, entrepreneurs to make these things happen. This is the kind of thing that's required. I mentioned capital goods. Capital goods are the goods that produce. Capital goods are not final products. They're what are used in the production process. And so this is these are the physical assets we need to build up again to be a productive economy. And in this process, this is how we build up the real value of the US dollar. You know, all of these sanctions, countries are fleeing away from the US dollar. This is very deliberate. The financial oligarchy is attempting to break the US dollar, all right, as the medium of exchange. Now, we set ourselves up. You and I didn't, but Richard Nixon, advised by George Shultz and others, set us up, taking the dollar off the gold standard, gold reserve systems, in 1971, August 15th, 1971, the day of infamy, right? So the dollar, which was productive, was unhitched. And with Rambouillet, a couple of years later, a floating exchange rate system was put in place, so-called, and the result is a disaster. So what's required now as part of this rebuilding process then is a new financial system, a return to a hard commodity, gold reserve based, fixed exchange rate, fixed exchange, no floating whatevers. You know, as we discussed last week, long-term investment requires stable conditions. And that's particularly the case in trade, but also otherwise. So you need fixed exchange rates. Again, returning to a fixed exchange rate system, gold reserve based, hard commodity based otherwise. That's where we've got to go. This is mission critical for our economy. It's key to developing the capital goods sector. I want to use an example. After World War II, this is, this was the Bretton Woods system. The new Bretton Woods system, brought in after World War II, organized the fixed exchange rate system with the dollar as the major currency. The dollar was backed not only by gold, but by our productive power, our export of real productive output. That's what made the dollar as good as gold. The US lent to Germany. It lent to the European countries, France, and so on and so forth, to rebuild after World War II. We extended credit to those countries. What did those countries do with that credit? They turned around and bought our physical goods, and our economy grew in that process. And as their economies grew, they paid back those loans. That's the process of credit as it can operate among countries. An example of how under a fixed exchange rate system, you build up the economy. And that was FDR's perspective coming out of World War II, to do that with the world. Unfortunately, his ideas were superseded by little Truman and the British recolonization with the IMF and World Bank and all the rest as instruments, turned into instruments of that process. But But the Bretton Woods system, as it operated between particularly the United States and Europe, is a good example of what a new fixed exchange rate system, how it would operate. Consider today, countries around the globe, and I'm just wrapping this up more or less here, countries around the world hold reserves of dollars. There's about 14 billion, 12, 14 billion, somewhere in there, out there, electronic annotations, notations, and so forth, a small amount of paper. About half of the US dollars, Federal Reserve notes, are held by foreign individuals and interests and so forth right now. But there's 12 to 14 trillion out there otherwise in total. They're being held largely as reserves. 60% of all foreign reserves of nations are now held in dollars. In US, held in treasury notes, probably more total in terms of investment in other US assets. But those dollars are just, they're frozen out there. With a fixed, why are they holding them? Third world countries, the global south, as they call it these days, hold these dollars because they fear capital flight. In a floating exchange rate system, they never know whether they could be clobbered, that money could leave their country, and they could be, driven into extreme poverty. So they hold dollars as reserves against such a threat. Well, you go to a fixed exchange rate system, those dollars become available to do what? To purchase our capital goods, to purchase the requirements to build up their respective sovereign full set economies. That's how we begin this process. And those dollars coming back turned into real US dollars as opposed to Federal Reserve notes can become part of the new expanded, growing Third National Bank and credit emission process of a further expansion of the economy. But there's a final feature of this that I want to just highlight. Why do we want to export? Well, this has to do with that machine tool principle and the process of growing a full set economy. That the ability of any economy to assimilate new technology is limited by the scale of that economy, that is the size, and it's limited by the rate of capital turnover. Capital here, we're not talking about funny money, we're talking about that heavy machinery, those fixed assets. The faster those are utilized, the more that they're utilized in the production process, the faster they're depreciated, the faster they have to be replaced by newer technology, newer equipment, right? You feed back into the productive process upstream. You create new demands. By exporting, not relying on imports and so forth, but by becoming once again an exporting nation, which we should want to be, an exporting nation, we simultaneously drive forward. We expand the scale of our productive activity, agro-industrial activity, and we increase the rate of turnover, capital goods turnover in our physical economy. So that's a lot, but I hope that gives you some new insights. We should be confident that we can accomplish this. We've done it. As I've tried to emphasize before, we can do it even better tomorrow and the day after. We can become a productive nation again. And in doing so, we will lead the world. And this is the process. 22 elections, the 24 elections, the MAGA movement, LaRouche's economic ideas, not just as ideas, but as they're out there. They're out there in Russia. They're out there in China. These ideas are India. They're out there. A confident leadership in the United States, as exemplified by a second Trump administration, is the kind of leadership that can bring Putin, Xi, and Modi to the table to hash out a four-powers agreement and the creation of a new fixed exchange rate, gold reserve monetary system with the dollar very much at its center. So I'll leave it there for discussion. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it's worthwhile.